Well, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this conversation about philanthropy in 2020 and where it's going in 2021. I'm Doug Stewart, Chairman at Marts Lundy, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for this discussion. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of senior consultants from Marts Lundy, who I'll introduce now. First, Penelope Hunt, Managing Principal in our education practice and a prominent consultant in higher education and in the arts and culture sector. Also, Karen Callahan, Managing Principal in our education practice and one of the top experts in independent schools philanthropy. And finally, Frank Interlicchia, a senior member of our healthcare practice. Well, 2020 was a year like no other, and a year most of us wish not to repeat. Philanthropy in 2020 was complicated, to be sure. By last March, COVID-19 was a worldwide pandemic. Unemployment spiked shortly thereafter, and then we fell into a recession. Then social justice concerns boiled over and dominated the news and many of our institutions. Yet the stock market performed strongly. It was a year of mixed indicators. Penelope Hunt, let me turn to you first. The Giving USA results that were just released seem to indicate that 2020 was actually a good year for philanthropy. Was it?
Well, it depends on what we compare it to. If we look at how 2020 turned out based on what we thought would happen, what we discussed a year ago at this time when the last Giving USA report came out, the fact that 2020 was somewhat unremarkable is what's remarkable about it. We did see some particular shifts that we'll talk about in the course of this hour, but overall, giving held strong. The levels of giving that we saw across all types of institutions and all types of donors combined went up by about the same percentage that it tends to go up every year. So it's the specifics within that where we see some possibly interesting quirks, but nothing nearly as radical as many of us expected a year ago.
So what was remarkable about the year is that it was not so remarkable.
That's right.
Okay, well, let's get some input from our webinar participants and see what their experience was. We're going to do an instant poll and ask you, in 2020, did you raise more than you had expected? Did you raise less than you had expected? Or did you raise about as much as you had expected at the beginning of 2020? Take a moment to vote, please, and we'll see what your responses were on the question of compared to your expectation as of January 2020, did you raise more, less, or about the same as you had expected? Penelope, staying with you for a second while people are voting, it seems to me that Giving USA said that philanthropy was up, but it seemed like, as you said, that was an uptick about as we would normally expect, and adjusted for inflation was probably almost flat. Is that your interpretation?
Yes. When we adjust for inflation, we see that the trend line of overall giving has been essentially flat-ish for several years. We've seen that the percentage of GDP that is given has remained right around the 2% mark, fluctuating up a little, down a little. It was up a little this past year, but I think it's not up so much that we should consider that that's a significant finding. So overall, the numbers look like probably what we would have expected in January of 2020, even though they don't look like what we expected in June of 2020.
Exactly. Yeah. By March or April, many of us were predicting it was going to be a terrible year for philanthropy. Yet I remember that our advice when we were doing this webinar a year ago was to stay the course. And I think that proved to be good advice for everyone, because philanthropy ended up being strong and most of our institutions performed well. So I'm interested in what our participants' experiences were, and it looks like we'll get those results here right now. So 46% of our webinar participants say they raised more than expected. 28% said they raised about as much as they expected. Only a quarter said that they raised less than they had expected back in January 2020. That's certainly consistent with my experience with our clients. And it is remarkable. It is really remarkable given what a year of tumult we've gone through. Penelope, staying with you, I want to comment a little bit on the stock market, which was so strong in 2020. The S&P 500 index was up 16%. I'm curious what our participants would say. Let's do another poll. If you look solely at how strong the markets were in 2020, would you have expected your fundraising to have outperformed the market, underperformed the market, or that you should have performed about in tandem with the market? So stay with us and fill out that question on the market on your performance relative to the stock market. Penelope, what typically happens in strong stock market performance years?
The highest levels of giving, large major gifts and principal gifts, track with the market because they're almost always given from assets. And when donors feel asset rich, they're more likely to give. Last year in late Q1, as the pandemic was settling in, and certainly in Q2, when there were still expectations that markets would fall along with the recession emerging, a lot of financial advisors were telling their clients to give it away, to give while the market was high. And some of the very large gifts we saw were driven by that accumulated wealth in donors' portfolios. What's been interesting is that the markets still haven't figured out that we had a recession. They've continued to climb, they're continuing to climb, and financial advisors are still predicting a crash. And so they're still telling their clients to give. And we should take this as a sign that many of our higher end prospects are in a very good position to give. They're motivated to give. And our encouragement of them giving is being supported by their advisors. So it positions most organizations really well to be having very forthright conversations with their higher end prospects about outright gifts.
Interesting. Well, let's see how our participants responded to the question of looking solely at how strong the markets were in 2020. Would you have expected your fundraising to outperform the markets? Only 12% said yes. Underperformed, only about 10% said yes. And we should have performed in tandem with the markets. About 80% said yes to that. That's about what I would expect as well. Going along with what Penelope said, particularly at the major and principal gift level where people are giving from assets that tracks the stock market. Frank Interlicia, healthcare was in many ways really central to the events of 2020. Talk to us about healthcare fundraising. And I was surprised, and I think others were surprised by the finding in Giving USA this year that healthcare philanthropy was actually down in 2020. What do you make of that? Was it actually down?
Yes and no. So let me talk about that a little. There's no doubt that giving to healthcare, particularly supporting frontline workers and COVID research, were center stage in 2020. And as you said, based on this visibility, the urgency of the cause, most of us were expecting to see a marked increase in giving to health. But the Giving USA number reports that it's down 4.2% adjusted for inflation. So as I look at that, there are two items for context that I think we need to keep in front of us. First is that $42 billion in contributions, which was the total in 2020, was actually tied for the second highest inflation adjusted value recorded to date. So this was not a bad year, even if there was a slight downturn according to these numbers. And this echoes Penelope's opening comment about the remarkable thing in 2020 being with everything that was going on, especially with the global economy, that it was essentially a solid year for philanthropy in general and for giving to health. And so the second item for context is that Giving USA does use a particular methodology that splits out some health giving into a different category. So for those of us who have an inner data nerd, you can pay attention. For those of you who aren't, you can ignore this. the report has a section at the end called a brief summary of methods used, where you can learn more about the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities Codes, which is actually what the IRS uses to recognize tax exempt status and categorize organizations. So under this system, the health category includes gifts to general and specialty hospitals, community health systems, an array of research institutions and organizations, but not academic medical centers that fall under higher education. And when I worked in academic medicine, the dollars brought in that we brought into the organization were half of what the university raised, so it could be significant. My favorite single example of this is, if you recall the $1 million gift that Dolly Parton made to Vanderbilt Medical Center late last year. It was for COVID-19 research, and it actually helped fund the critical early stage work on the Moderna vaccine. This gift would have been categorized as higher education and not health. So I think we can see that we just need to be aware that in this methodology, there could be some depression in the totals of the health category because of this. Now, just looking more broadly and speaking with clients around the country, it looked a lot like some of the polls we've done so far. There's a real diversity of experience. So both on the East and West Coast, I've talked to clients whose experience reflected a slight decline in giving last year. Some clients have reported significant increases, and some were mixed, where the beginning of the year started stronger, especially with donors that had existing commitments, and that it weakened as the year went on. But we've heard a lot of feedback too about how donor behavior changed this past year, and this might have affected the numbers as well. And we look at reports of people redirecting or splitting their gifts with organizations that provide direct human services, food banks, homeless shelters, et cetera. There's a lot of non-traditional giving that happened in the past year, and we've seen numerous instances of donors buying thousands of meals for healthcare workers from area restaurants as a way of supporting both the front lines and local businesses. So this was a way to support the economy and higher ed. And and lastly, we've heard an awful lot of reports of a hesitancy of new donors to commit or connect just because of uncertainty about the economy and the market. So I think a solid year for giving to health. I wouldn't read too much into what Giving USA reports as a decline.
Okay, and so especially important to note that academic medical centers were not included in that health category in the Giving USA report. Thanks, Frank. So let's do a poll and see what our friends out there in the audience would say. If you are in a healthcare related organization, did your fundraising outperform your 2020 goals and expectations, underperform your 2020 goals and expectations, or perform about as you expected early in 2020? This is for those of you in health-related organizations. Take just a moment to complete this instant poll. Frank, while we're waiting for the instant poll, what would you say about how giving to healthcare organizations might have mirrored disaster relief or disaster fundraising?
Yeah, it is very interesting because we've all seen the sort of spike in one-time giving that happens around disaster fundraising, and giving to COVID has a lot of the same characteristics. One particular case is a client we have in the Mountain Time Zone. Had a 200% increase in the number of donors last year. They're an independent community hospital that really has a very supportive following, but they added 2,000 new donors, and right now it's too early to tell if by through their annual fund efforts and gift officer outreach how many of those they'll be able to retain. And so I think my only real comment on it, Doug, would be let's make sure we're asking the right question about new donors who came in because of COVID, And the question might not be how do we retain them, but how do we retain the best prospects in that pool?
Yeah.
So for instance, if my client retains only 10% of their 2,000 donors, that will fill a major gift or a leadership annual gift portfolio for a gift officer. So that could be a real benefit.
That's a really interesting way of thinking of that. If they retain just 10% of their 2,000 new donors, that's a major gift officer's portfolio right there. Wow. Well, let's see what the results of our poll are on healthcare organizations' performance. Well, 44% said they outperformed their 2020 goals, and 40% said they underperformed their 2020 goals, with about 16% saying that they performed as expected. So mixed results, as you have experienced.
I feel much better about my informal survey of clients now, because that's exactly what I heard as well.
Great. Karen Callahan, let me turn to you. The Giving USA numbers don't break out independent schools from higher education. What did you see in the school sector? How did independent schools fare during this year?
Well, I mean, we don't have any comprehensive data on this and are unlikely to for the year 2020 because, they track against fiscal years. But we do know from our clients and from some of their affiliated networks that it was a year that really could be characterized as uneven, that some experienced great gains, some experienced more challenges. And probably the three factors that influenced that most was the success to pivoting to a remote environment and that second pivot to opening the institution safely. The second is what is the composition of the donor base. We know that COVID did not impact all geographies equally. So there were some professions and some geographies that were far more challenged, particularly where it was heavily hospitality, retail, service industry. Those that experienced, I would say, real upticks in giving were more likely to be in the financial industries or the tech industries. And the third was the response by the advancement office. There were some that moved quickly to a remote setting and found really innovative and creative ways to bring their office together virtually and also to continue the work with donors. But there were some institutions where the head of school actually blocked their fundraising for fear of PR issues, fear that their constituencies were too hurt by the economy of COVID. And then there were others that experienced just some paralysis, taking a while to really figure out what to do. So uneven.
Yeah. So Karen, a follow-up question. Paint for us a picture of a top performing independent school in 2020, not necessarily one of the super elite boarding schools, but a typical school that has performed as well as or better than expected. What does that look like?
Well, there are actually a couple of schools that I have in mind. One is a boarding school, and the other is a day school, a K through 12 day school. And there are about 5 or 6 things that they have in common that I think explain their success. The first is both of them experienced budget cuts, but both of them chose to retain all of their frontline fundraisers. They made a strong case for this with their heads and CFOs and were able to retain that population. They were both in campaigns and they were unapologetic about continuing on with this. They maintained their line of sight to their vision but applied a new lens to the priorities, given everything that was occurring over the past year. Because they were in a campaign, they had been in a serious outreach mode even before the pandemic hit. So they were able to, they had built momentum, they continued that momentum, And it really positioned them, I think, favorably to have a very strong pipeline of donors that were at the ready, that were clearly loyal and going to be investing. And in both cases, they had some key donors that rearranged some of their giving plans to front load giving, knowing that there were going to be others that would have more difficulty in being able to fulfill their commitments. And then last, I would say, well, no, two more things. They gave very special attention to parked philanthropy and with DAFs and foundations and planned giving that was ripe for becoming outright gifts. And then last, I would say for both of them, the head of school was very present with the external constituency, not just the internal. We saw a lot of turtling down, turtling in by some heads for very good reasons with all they were dealing with. But in both these cases, kept some balance in staying connected with the constituency, communicating with them, and especially with key donors to make them aware of how the school was progressing through this.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Let me switch gears and look at our 2021 pipeline. And if we can get an instant poll on this, I think it would be interesting. At this point in 2021, are you concerned about your 2021 pipeline because of a lack of cultivation over the past year? So let us know how concerned you are, very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned about your current major gift pipeline for 2021 because of a lack of cultivation over the past year. So about a month ago, I convened a group of chief advancement officers from some pretty elite institutions, and several of them talked about losing a year of cultivation. It was something that was causing them a lot of loss of sleep. So did we really lose a year of cultivation? Are we worried about the major gift pipeline because of that? You know, one of the other things that was interesting is that group also said they lost a year of generating big ideas. They couldn't get the focus of their board leadership. They couldn't get the focus of their CEO or other executive or institutional leaders focused on big ideas because everyone was responding to the pandemic and the immediate crisis. And so there's a concern that we may have lost a year of generating big ideas, as well as a year of cultivating major donors. And are we going to see that come home to roost in 2021? Let's see what our audience says about that. Interesting. Okay, so only 17% of you are very concerned about losing a year of cultivation. 44% were somewhat concerned. 39% were not concerned. So that's really good news. That's encouraging that cultivation apparently was going forward, at least to some degree, if not fulsomely, during 2020 and early into 2021. I would say that's a good news finding. Well, let's turn to your questions now. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and feel free to ask us any questions that's on your mind, and we will do our best to give you some perspective. We've got a couple of questions already in the queue. The first one or two are related. Is this a good time to start a campaign? Well, it's a better time than last year. Penelope, what would you say?
Absolutely. Absolutely a good time. There is an increased optimism across at least the US society and culture. There's a sense that we're beginning to understand what our new normal lifestyles will look like. And the world has changed, and our donors want to hear what we're doing about it. They want to hear what organizations they support are staking out as their claim for their next big push. And I would echo I also saw organizations have a hard time focusing on big ideas last year. When a cabinet was having to meet every day to figure out how to keep a community safe, it was hard to step away from that and really think about what could come next. And many of them didn't know how to determine the context in which they would be pursuing those big ideas. We're a lot better informed now. We much better understand the environment around how our organizations will pursue big ideas. And this is a great time to be talking to donors about them.
Yeah. A related question that was posed is, what will campaigns look like in this post-pandemic era in terms of length and scope? Will they be any different? Frank or Karen, any thoughts on that?
Sure. I don't think it's going to be terribly different. The ones that have been in process and the ones that are beginning right now are really slated to run the same course. It might take a little bit longer. The timing might change a little bit, but in terms of the structure of a campaign, the one thing that may change is that more there might be more outreach virtually than had happened in pre-pandemic days, but otherwise I don't think there will be a dramatic change.
Okay.
Doug, I would just add, I agree with Karen about perhaps more virtual outreach. I think we've seen even in our client work across the board that the gift officers who've used the tool well have talked to more people and different people more easily than they would have in pre-pandemic era. And also there's a mixed COVID blessing in all of this, that many donors have honed in on what's important to them and the causes they want to make sure continue and thrive. So that I think is something, actually, it's there's going to be a bit of a springboard, campaign or not, that is going to be useful there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Frank. A somewhat related question. It's rather broad. What, if anything, is going to be permanently different now after 2020? Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, I'll just throw out one thing for us. I don't know how permanent it will be, but certainly will continue a little bit in this vein. But we have a study that's out in the field right now on post-COVID staffing that was delivered out to advancement leaders. And while we don't have the full results, what we do know from those who've already responded is that about 73% of them said that prior to COVID, all staff worked on site. Whereas looking at post-COVID, what the policies are, or they are considering them to be, only 27% said that all staff will be on site. So this is really a dramatic shift in the way that we come together, the way that we do work, the way that we understand what can be achieved. I know, Penelope, we were talking a little bit earlier about some other information that you had that you could maybe broaden this out a little bit.
When we think back to the before times, working not in the office for a development officer was not the norm. It was the exception to the rule. And when we would survey development officers, we would find that high priority for them in job satisfaction was flexibility in both location and hours of working. And we had organizations that were not flexible about hours and location. They expected all the teams to be together in the same place at the same time. Now that we've seen that it can work to have everyone spread around all over the place, some of the leadership, CEOs, chief development officers, who were not open to that kind of flexibility before March of 2020, now see it differently. They've had a solid test case now to know that it can work and that they can maintain performance standards. They can trust that employees will maintain connections and their level of performance. And I think this will help organizations recruit development officers. One of the biggest challenges we hear from chief development officers all the time is the talent pool, recruiting and retaining good officers. If you add flexibility in location and timing to your benefits, the definition of your positions, I suspect you will have an easier time competing for that talent that you may have had a hard time getting in the past.
Okay, great. We've got two questions that are sort of related to each other, so I'm going to pose them both. What COVID-adjacent philanthropic opportunities did your clients leverage, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, and so forth? That was one question. And another one was, there were many changes of focus in 2020 due to pandemic and civil unrest. Do you expect donors will continue to be interested in the case for health equity and social justice? Any trends showing shifting interest? Anybody want to comment on that shifting landscape?
Actually, Doug, just from a healthcare perspective, I think certainly the conversation has changed. There's no doubt. So that, and it's interesting, it's changed for us as a firm as well as for our clients. So part of the fabric of our conversations with clients now include issue DEI. With our healthcare clients, when we look at issues of health equity and how the pandemic disproportionately affected communities of color, many of our clients have incorporated this into the strategic planning and into their campaign planning. So one client right now, it's a pillar of health equity is a pillar of their campaign and the initiatives where they're going to reach out and partner in the community in new ways. So I don't think this is a passing trend. I think it's an important direction, and I think it's important for all of us as professionals in whatever our capacity to keep it front and center.
Well, I will share, I told you that I convened a group of chief advancement officers from some elite institutions recently. And one of the things that they said kept them awake at night was DEI issues. And that took on two different forms. One was DEI in their workplace, but the other was DEI issues as pillars of campaigns and fundraising opportunities, and that the institutions were eager to focus on those as campaign pillars or themes, but they were getting mixed results in terms of donor interest.
Yeah, there's a third component to that organizations should be thinking about in the DEI umbrella, which is how they are engaging constituencies that are not the traditional white, often male, wealthy potential donors. There's an enormous amount of wealth among non-white constituencies, and yet we rarely see organizations giving the same level of attention to non-white potential constituencies that they give to white constituencies because of the tradition. And our indications are that it's not that non-white constituencies don't give, it's that they don't get asked. And that's a very different problem. So we need to be thinking about how we diversify our fundraising approaches to align with whatever the diversity is in our constituencies, whether it's age diversity or geographic or cultural or ethnic or racial, if it's religious, if it's socioeconomic. The one size fits all has absolutely become one size fits one. And if we don't adapt to listen, to ask our constituencies what they need to know in order to feel engaged and inspired to give, we're certainly going to miss some major opportunities.
Yeah. Here's an interesting comment and question. It's too early to tell, but we believe there may be vestiges of virtual events and virtual meetings that remain. For example, we continue to have success in reaching a wide geographic audience of major gift donors and prospects via virtual events, and we plan to continue with them. We also sense that travel may be reduced compared to the pre-COVID era due to the fact that donors are comfortable and find it more convenient to meet virtually. What is the sense of the group in terms of this? Well, I would say absolutely that sense is right. I think we have learned that we can do things virtually that we never imagined doing, any other way. Some of our major gift officers have even found that they can accelerate the cycle of development because they don't have to say, well, I'm going to be in your city in 3 weeks. I'm going to be in your city in 2 months. Can I stop in for a visit? They can now have scheduled visits for 15 minutes and move the conversation along as it organically needs to. So I think that this is absolutely something that we're going to see continuing. To Joe, who asked the question, I would also say we're seeing this change in the way that we do our consulting work. So pre-COVID, we did all of our campaign feasibility studies, for example, with in-person interviews. During the past year, we've been doing them all virtually, and it turns out that has worked splendidly. We've had incredibly deep, rich conversations with our potential donors in these feasibility study interviews. And I don't know that we'll go back to doing most of them in person. I think it's more convenient for people and it's more efficient to do them virtually. So I think this is a trend that's going to be with us for quite a while.
Doug, I would echo the vestiges of virtual events. Absolutely, virtual components are going to be a part of our events. I would encourage everybody in the audience to go to LinkedIn and find me. My first name is spelled with all E's, last name Hunt, because I posted an article yesterday that you should read. It's about the first fundraising gala in Washington, D.C. of the season. It was held by the Washington Ballet, and they did an outstanding job of weaving both in-person and virtual components of their event so that people who wanted to participate in person could, people who didn't yet feel comfortable could, people who wanted to be in a big group could, people who wanted to be in a tiny group could. Their creativity in thinking about that is a good model for us to look at, because many of the people who started participating in virtual events were people who had not participated in in-person events. And we want to be sure that we give them a way to stay connected and don't exclude them by going entirely back to in-person activities.
Yeah. We've got two questions that may be related. One is, what should we be telling our donors about upcoming tax increases? The other is, what are some of the best planned giving strategies during this time that you saw? Let's take the tax question first. Anyone want to tackle that? I would say one thing, while my panelists are thinking about an answer to that, I would say one thing about the tax question, and that is, in a macro sense, we don't find that tax policy actually impacts contributions that much. When you go all the way back to the Great Depression, and marginal tax rates, income tax rates have varied from 5 or 10% all the way up to 90%. And the tax policies have been all over the map since the Great Depression. We find that charitable giving continues to track the GDP at about 2%. And so overall, tax policy doesn't affect charitable giving that much. Does it affect an individual donor and their individual timing and circumstances? Absolutely. What can we say about Biden tax increases? I don't know that any of us on this panel are capable of predicting what's going to get through the Senate. At the moment, it doesn't look like Biden is probably going to have much luck with some of his proposals getting through the Senate, but I don't know if Karen or Penelope or Frank, you have anything else you want to add about what we should be telling donors about upcoming tax increases.
Okay, I think I would continue to echo that it's a factor beyond our control, and if it is foremost in their minds and taxes go up, they should give more and give often. But ultimately, it's about supporting the cause, and they will get some kind of tax benefit for it. But it's hopefully not a main motivator.
At the highest levels of giving, taxation or a tax deduction has so little effect on a person's tax situation that it's unlikely to be a major deciding factor. And where there's a big difference between income taxes and wealth taxes. Wealth taxes, which have not happened in this country, maybe ever, certainly not recently, that tends to be what the middle wealthy folks worry about the most. And we don't even have any proposals in play right now in Congress for wealth taxes. Income taxes are, as we've seen in recent media revelations, the wealthiest individuals in our society don't pay income taxes. So a change in income tax law would not probably affect the individuals in your constituency who are your highest level prospects. They may also be the ones who complain the most or are most vocal about worrying about taxes, but the reality is they are unlikely to see their wealth significantly affected by any of the ideas that have been floated in the last 5 to 7 years as possible tax changes.
Mm-hmm. And what about the other question about good planned giving strategies during this time? Anything novel or in terms of best practices that you've seen out there?
No, I don't know that it's that I'm seeing anything novel, just that there is a serious elevation in attention to this, that even for those, in the school shops where they have had no one really virtually looking at planned giving, they are beginning to staff up in that area, understanding that is one of the big shifts that we've seen over the past year and a half.
And I think I would add to that, Karen, and that because I've seen the same thing in some aging services clients who weren't paying much attention to it before, and really had a spike in increase, but it's emphasizing basic mechanisms, giving by bequest, the CARES Act, the Secure Act, whatever might help get this donors to act in the moment. But no real marvelous new techniques, just an increase in activity.
Yeah. Here's again a somewhat related question. What about donor advised funds? What's happening there? Penelope, this is in your wheelhouse, I think.
This is my favorite topic. Donor advised funds.
Get up on your soapbox now.
That's right. You can't tell, but I have climbed up onto my soapbox. Y'all, donor advised funds are free giving. The donors have already surrendered control of the assets. They've already seen their asset base decreased by the amount that they've put into their donor advised fund, and they've already taken the tax consequence if that mattered to them. Now they have all the time in the world to decide how they want to allocate that giving. First and foremost, in early conversations with potential prospects, there should be questions that officers are asking about how prospects make their gift, and do they use donor advised funds or a community foundation fund to give? If they do, that should be a signal to you that the ask of this individual can be painless. It will literally not cost them a dime to make a gift to your organization. And donor advised funds are invested. So as the markets go up, the value in those funds go up. And donors who are looking to have an impact from their donor advised fund can have a larger impact right now while the markets are high. And pay close attention to this bill that Senator Grassley has just started in committee that would put regulations on how soon donor advised funds have to be paid out to charities, and would change some of the requirements for professional foundations around payout and what can count as payout, both the level of payout they would be required to make and what they can count toward their payout. This is not the kind of thing that gets changed quickly, but I lived in Iowa in the late 1980s and Senator Grassley was working on this back then. So from his view, it's not quick, it's time. Pay attention. This will be interesting, whether it fully passes or a part of it gets through. This could have a significant effect on our relationships with donor advised funds and professional foundations.
Okay, thanks, Penelope. John asks a really deep and sort of existential question. He says, we all know that higher education has been deeply impacted by the year of pandemic. And even before, many institutions have been in serious need of transformative change in order to survive and thrive in the 21st century. How receptive are major philanthropies to helping advance this broad and deep set of challenges? Wow, John, an amazing question. And, you know, it's one that I have thought about as I look at the landscape in healthcare and in education. There simply are too many institutions. There are too many, you know, there are still 5,000 community hospitals. The level of consolidation that we're going to be seeing there into systems, into health systems, is going to be breathtaking in the next 10 years. There are liberal arts colleges that are not going to make it. From my standpoint, I have not seen major philanthropies or major philanthropists interested in helping stave off the inevitable. That is, they're not interested in putting a Band-Aid on the systemic problem that a particular institution is having. But it seems to me that we may be able to interest major philanthropies in systemic solutions to smart integration and consolidation. Panelists, any thoughts about this sort of large question about the systemic changes that we know need to happen in the next century and the role of philanthropy?
I think the only thing I would add to that, Doug, and I agree with your assessment, is that as we look at the societal issues right now and how major philanthropies have responded to that, and even changes that I'm sure all of us have seen, even at more local levels, foundations have been giving larger gifts, unrestricted gifts to organizations who are demonstrating commitment to larger societal issues. The Ford Foundation had a huge initiative, others. So I think that I think from a funder's perspective, there's a convergence of the needs of institutions that transform and how they're moving forward. So I do believe there's movement there, but how much and to what extent is hard to say.
Yeah. Well, we've got a couple of sort of granular questions. One is, can you speak to the impact of 2020 on donor participation and how that may impact the lower end of the donor pyramid? You know, to me, the lower end of the donor pyramid has gotten bigger because we've seen so many small gifts for pandemic relief, both in education and in healthcare. But it begs the question that is in the first part of this question: what's the impact of donor participation? And the other question that I saw that was related is, how do we retain new donors we attracted in 2020 who gave because of COVID? Frank, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I will just piggyback on what Frank has already said, which is some of those donors are probably not retainable, and that may not be where you want to put your attention. I think it might be harder for smaller institutions to be thinking about it that way because their pools are more I think contained and constrained to do that. But those that leapt to the assistance of the institution to really carry you through, that really is like the disaster giving. If they have a natural affiliation with your institution, then you need to really play on that. You need to your stewardship around that group has to be about them being part of a really critical, pivotal moment for that institution. But I think for some of the larger organizations that we're dealing with, the ability to retain a very large percentage of those who jumped on board, I think is going to be challenging.
Yeah, and Karen, I would just add to that I think we really saw that loyal core of donors that stuck with their institutions are going to be critically important, and stewarding them is is huge, but there's still an awful lot of economic pressure on a lot of people right now. And I don't think we can underestimate that. And we will continue to reach out. Organizations will continue to reach out with their annual funds in every method we know how, but it just may take some while for that portion of the population to recover.
So here's an interesting question. Is there any attention being placed on the general public's trust in the current COVID protocols? Are individual donors concerned about another pandemic, whereas they will be less likely to give in 2021 and beyond? Well, I haven't seen or heard anything about that from my clients. I think my clients are all reporting that their donors are eager to get back to normal and are feeling guardedly optimistic about the future. Anybody have a countervailing sense of this?
So, since my clients tend to be in healthcare, they're usually very aware and very confident that things are going to move forward. So I don't see a degree of hesitation there at all.
Yeah, great. Well, we're nearly at the end of our time, and I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our participants for joining us. It's been an interesting discussion thinking about whether 2020 will inform 2021 giving and beyond. Again, the real takeaway from 2020 is that it was surprisingly strong and surprisingly normal in terms of overall results, even though the makeup of those results was driven by the pandemic and by other factors in social justice and so forth. I think it just points out that philanthropy is incredibly resilient in the United States and Canada, very resilient, a very structurally sound part of our economy. And I see many of our client institutions coming back very strongly with good pipelines and ready to pursue the big ideas that will transform their constituents and their communities. Any final words from our panelists?
I have just one thing, Doug. Some of our colleagues have been talking with us about their real concern about the focus, messaging focus on needs versus aspirations, and as we move into this next year, especially for fiscal years, for school years and higher ed years, that to be transitioning away from that with more of a forward view of what your aspirational hopes are, and have that really grounded in what you've learned from what we've been through for the last year and a half or so is going to be very important.
Yeah, Karen, what a great note to end on, reminding us of the fundamental premise of not focusing on our needs, but focusing on our aspirations and the future vision. Very important note. So thank you to our panelists, Karen Callahan, Penelope Hunt, Frank Inderlicchia. Thank you to all of our participants. We look forward to seeing you soon. Take care and be well.